presentation, Kate. So as Kate mentioned, my name is Igor Lehnherr, and I'm going to be talking about mercury contamination in Canada's Arctic. Okay, so I thought I would start with a quick outline of what I'm going to be covering in the talk today. I thought I'd start with a little bit of background to give you guys some important information about what is mercury, why it's a problem, why do we care about mercury contamination in the environment. And then I'm going to switch to look more specifically at the Arctic. We're going to look at the deposition of mercury in Arctic regions, mercury in wildlife, and also the exposure of northern residents to mercury through their consumption of traditional country foods such as seals and beluga whale and fish that may have elevated levels of mercury. And then we're going to look at a little bit with more detail into the sources of methylmercury to Arctic aquatic ecosystems. And as we go through this talk, you'll see it'll become apparent why methylmercury is really the key to understanding the issue of mercury contamination. So what is mercury? Mercury is an element. It's a metal. It's the only liquid metal at room temperature, which actually is a very important property. Because elemental mercury is liquid, it actually has a high vapor pressure, which allows it to be transported in the atmosphere. Methylmercury, which is an organic form of mercury, is a strong neurotoxin which bioaccumulates in food webs and biomagnifies, which is really the source of why mercury is a concern. And we're going to go through that in a little bit more detail. Also, right here is a picture of cinnabar, which is mercuric sulfide, which is a mineral that contains mercury, and it's the most common form of mercury in the Earth's crust, and how we often extract mercury from the ground. So just a little bit about mercury toxicity. So we know that mercury is a contaminant, and the concern there is because it's toxic to vertebrates, so animals and humans. So for example, Minamata disease, which is acute mercury poisoning, has symptoms which include speech and hearing impairment, loss of motor skill, blurred vision, numbness, and memory loss. But most of the concern is usually associated with the development of young children, because exposure to lower quantities of mercury can also be detrimental to their neurological development, which can affect language and visual and motor skills later on in life. And one way to think about it is also mercury isn't just an issue for people who care about the environment, but even from an economist point of view, mercury is a very important issue. A study has come out estimating that 1.8 million children born each year in the European Union with exposure to very low levels of mercury will suffer some form of IQ deficit, which results in a socioeconomic cost of 8 to 9 billion euros per year. So mercury exposure has huge socioeconomic costs as well, which makes it such an important issue. So just a little bit of terminology to get everybody on the same page and orientated a little bit. So there's different forms of mercury, so different chemical species of mercury that occur in the environment. The first one I've got highlighted up there is elemental mercury, or Hg0. So that's the elemental form of mercury. So liquid mercury in a thermometer is elemental mercury, for example. And that's the form of mercury that's also most commonly found in the atmosphere. So that's how mercury gets transported between emission sources to other regions of the world. In the atmosphere, mercury can be oxidized to this Hg2, or inorganic mercury form, which itself is not volatile and becomes deposited to landscapes. Inorganic mercury is the form of mercury that's commonly found in soils, in lake waters, and in minerals in the ground. And then there's methylmercury, which I've already mentioned is the key species because it's the neurotoxin. So this is the most toxic form of mercury. It's also the form of mercury that is able to bioaccumulate in organisms and biomagnify through food webs. So one of the key steps that scientists are interested in is how inorganic mercury becomes methylated to form this methylmercury form. So, as you saw in the video, we talked a little bit about how methylmercury is bioaccumulated, which refers to the uptake of methylmercury into organisms at the bottom of the food chain. So, algae, bacteria, things like that. So it's the accumulation of mercury into an organism over time. And then the concentration of mercury in organisms increases as you go up the food chain. So with each level in the food chain, it becomes more and more concentrated. And the result of this is that you can have very low concentrations of methylmercury in the water, so 10 to the negative 7 parts per million, but end up with concentrations in top predators that are 10 ppm. So over a million-fold increase in the concentration of methylmercury as a result of this biomagnification phenomenon. So another way to look at, to help you wrap your mind around biomagnification, if you think about it, you have a very large number of algae, each with a little bit of methylmercury in it, that gets eaten by a shrimp, but the shrimp eats many algae and accumulates all that methylmercury in its body, increasing the concentration of methylmercury within the shrimp. And with each level in the food chain, because each predator consumes a lot of its prey, and you can't eliminate that methylmercury once it's in your body, the concentrations of methylmercury become progressively higher and higher as you move up the food chain. Okay, so why do we have a lot of mercury in the environment? Well, because we have a number of uses for mercury, and mercury is also emitted as a result of a number of industrial activities. So this pie chart here shows the various sources of mercury emissions from human activities. And you can see that by far the biggest is fossil fuel combustion. And the reason for this is coal combustion in particular is a big culprit for this, because coal contains trace amounts of mercury. And when you combust coal, often for power generation, that mercury gets released to the atmosphere. Other common uses of mercury is used to extract gold because it forms an alloy with gold, which is very useful when extracting gold in mining operations. We also use mercury for a whole bunch of other applications in electrical switches, in dentistry, for chloralkali production. And historically, mercury was used to treat beaver fur to make felt hats. And that's where the Mad Hatter syndrome concept came from, because the people treating the fur with mercury would develop symptoms of exposure to this contaminant. But of course, there's also natural sources of mercury to the environment, and these include volcanoes that can emit mercury to the atmosphere, biomass burning, so burning of forest during forest fires, and emissions from soils and surface waters. So these two graphs show where most of the mercury that's emitted to the environment comes from. So as you can see, this pie chart here sort of breaks it down by continent, and you can see that Asia is by far the largest emitter of mercury to the environment. And a lot of that here, this is sort of broken down by the various countries, and you can see that China is by far and away the largest emitter of mercury to the environment. Primarily because of their recent industrial growth, and which has led to a higher demand for electricity, and which has resulted in a more combustion of coal for generating electricity. So in places like China, India, a lot of that is from fossil fuel combustion. In other places, a lot of the mercury that's emitted, so from the orange color here, you can see in Indonesia, Colombia, Brazil, mercury emissions there are primarily the result of extraction of gold. So I thought I'd show also a bit of where are we headed in terms of mercury emissions around the world? So as I kind of hinted in the last slide, mercury emissions in Asia are increasing. So from 1990 to 2005, you can see a dramatic increase. But in other places, like Europe and North America, you see steady decreases in mercury emissions. And that's the result of implementation of emission control technology. So the technology does exist that we can actually use scrubbers from flue stacks and remove some of those mercury emissions before they escape from a power plant to the atmosphere, for example. So this is a schematic that shows, don't worry too much about the details, but it shows some of the main pathways involved in the global mercury cycle. So you see, as I mentioned, some of the natural sources of mercury to the atmosphere, so volcanoes, you've got human activity releasing mercury to the atmosphere, biomass burning, and then you have vegetation and soils which can also emit mercury. And this one's sort of a mix of natural and anthropogenic sources because it's mercury that's deposited either from natural anthropogenic sources that then gets re-emitted to the atmosphere. And then as I mentioned, once in the atmosphere, elemental mercury can be oxidized to this inorganic form, which then deposits either to surface waters or back to landscapes. But the main point I really want to highlight here is these numbers circled in red. So you can see here in the atmosphere, the total mass of mercury in the atmosphere has increased 300 to 500%. So that's 4 to 6-fold since the onset of industrialization. So as a result of human activity, we've increased the reservoir of mercury in the atmosphere by a large quantity. This is also apparent in the ocean, where the amount of mercury in the surface ocean has tripled since about 1850. But for the intermediate and the deeper ocean, those increases are much smaller, something like 20 to or even 10%. And that's just because of the time scale involved with ocean circulation. It can take centuries for some of that surface water to mix down into the bottom of the ocean. And that's why that anthropogenically released mercury hasn't worked its way down that far yet. So this is what I call the human effect. And in a lot of it, not only with respect to mercury, but a lot of other elements, one of the primary ways that we disrupt a natural cycle is we extract large quantities of an element from a particular reservoir. So in the case of mercury, it's mercury that's been locked away deep underground, and we bring it to the surface when we release it to the atmosphere and surface waters. Carbon is another perfect example. We extract fossil fuels that were locked away deep underground, burn them, and release that carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But in the case of mercury, this has actually been going on for quite a long time. And when I first learned about this, I found this astounding. So this graph shows the accumulation of mercury in lake sediment cores from the Andes in South America. And so they were able to extract a sediment core long enough to go back to about 2000 BC. So this is a phenomenally long temporal record of mercury accumulation in this lake in the Andes. And you can see that, so you have your baseline accumulation rate here. And it starts increasing as early as 1200 BC. And what is that from? That's the result of of early Andean cultures, so pre-Incas, and even later on continuing through to the Incas, extracting mercury. So in those days, mercury was extracted and sought after because cinnabar has a beautiful red color, which they use to, for example, paint masks like these. So for thousands of years, actually, humans have had an impact on the mercury cycle. So that's a little bit of background on mercury, what we use it for, where it comes from. So I think now we're ready to sort of look at the Arctic in a little bit more detail. So one of the questions I get asked often when people find out what I do is how does mercury get to the Arctic? How can you go to a place that has no industrial development, no point sources, and have concern about pollution? As I mentioned, the elemental form of mercury is very volatile. and can actually stay in the atmosphere for 6 months to up to a year. And in that sort of a time frame, that's long enough for atmospheric currents to come from Europe, North America, South Asia, East Asia, pretty much most of the northern hemisphere, and carry mercury that's been emitted at lower latitudes, carry it to the Arctic where it becomes deposited. And then you also have ocean currents here from the Atlantic and from the Pacific that bring mercury as well. So this really hammers home the point that mercury is a global pollutant. It can be emitted in one place and deposited, halfway around the world. So it's really an environmental issue that has no political boundaries. And a problem of this kind of global scale also requires a global scale answer. So for the case of mercury, it's obviously reduction in emissions on a large scale that requires the cooperation of many nations. So these two figures also kind of highlight the connectivity between global mercury sources and mercury in the Arctic. So in the top panel here, we have mercury production, so sort of how much mercury has been mined over the past decades from 1930 to about 2010. And then the bar graphs, the bars here show the mercury emissions. So we don't have data going back as far, but you see the general trend here. You kind of get an increase and a peak in the 70s and 80s, and then a slight, you get a decline after that. And so if you go to Greenland, to one of the ice sheets, and you drill through the ice and the snow, and you measure mercury in air bubbles that were trapped when that snow and ice formed decades ago, you can reconstruct what the mercury concentrations in air in Greenland were at the time. And if you plot these, this is what they look like. And you'll notice a striking similarity between the shape of this, which is mercury concentrations in ice in Greenland over time, with our mercury production graph up here. So again, there's a very strong connectivity between global mercury production, global mercury emissions, and what we find in the Arctic. So as you saw in the video, we can use lake sediment cores to reconstruct the deposition of contaminants, including mercury, to ecosystems such as lakes. And these graphs show data that was obtained from sediment cores throughout the Arctic. So the first one here, don't worry about the difference between the red and the blue. It doesn't matter. They both show the same trend. And that trend is that actually mercury deposition decreases, so anthropogenic mercury flux, so the mercury of anthropogenic origin that's deposited to Arctic landscapes, decreases as you go further and further north. So that's sort of not surprisingly, and it still is consistent with our concept that the Arctic isn't as heavily impacted as a region that's heavily industrialized, for example. And then on this side, we have for subarctic and Arctic sediments, if you look at the dotted line, it's the fractional increase in the deposition of mercury compared to 1900. So until about 1960, that value is 1. So there's no difference between 1900 through to 1960. The deposition of mercury has stayed stable. But then we see an increase, and again here, so values to 2 to 3 times. So we see that the anthropogenic impact of the Arctic has been to increase deposition of mercury by a factor of about 2 to 3 since about the 1960s. So of course the question, we don't necessarily care how much mercury is in sediments, but we're certainly more concerned about mercury in wildlife and people. So I wanted to show you some data on long-term trends in mercury concentrations in the Arctic specifically. So this graph here shows mercury concentrations as a percentage of present day. So if you look, so present day here we have mercury concentrations in a whole range of organisms, including beluga, peregrine falcon, or polar bears, and even humans. So present day, 100%. So that's. But if you go back in time, you see that centuries ago, those mercury concentrations in the same organisms were only a tenth of what they are now. So, a really important point also I want to make here is that there's a disproportionate increase observed between how much mercury is increased in the atmosphere since industrialization, how much it's increased in the surface ocean, how much deposition to Arctic landscapes has increased. In all those cases, that increase is roughly threefold. But when you look at the increase in mercury concentrations over time in Arctic wildlife, that increase is now 10 times. So it's showing that Arctic ecosystems are particularly sensitive to mercury contamination. And why there's sort of a discrepancy between an increase of 3 times in mercury emission and deposition and a tenfold increase in how much mercury we find in wildlife, it has to do with specific processes. So is the Arctic particularly good at converting inorganic mercury into the methyl mercury form that accumulates in food webs? Is bioaccumulation and biomagnification of contaminants particularly efficient in the Arctic? And the answer is it's a combination of all those things. So here's an example of total mercury concentrations in polar bear liver. And here on the bottom are all the different polar bear populations from in the west. You have Alaska, moving east all the way through to eastern Greenland. And if you look at the green dots first, these are the unadjusted or raw concentrations of mercury in polar bear liver. You see that certain populations stand out. Like there's not a whole lot of mercury in polar bear livers in Alaska, but there's a lot in Beaufort Sea polar bear. And that's maybe puzzling at first. But if you'll recall, we talked about how mercury biomagnifies through food webs and food chains. And the longer the food chain, the more of this biomagnification you get. So the blue dots are actually the same data, but corrected for the length of the food chain that the polar bears are feeding on. So once you do that, you notice that the differences become much smaller. So in essence, these bears in the Beaufort Sea, their mercury levels are high primarily because they're feeding on the longer food chain. So that sort of highlights the fact that mercury levels in wildlife depend on a whole number of factors. Some of the variability in the blue dots, there's still some differences between the different regions, and that's because some regions have more methyl mercury in the water. So you have a combination of abiotic factors, such as the supply of methyl mercury into the food web, as well as ecological factors, such as food chain length, that all play a role. So here we have a map of the Canadian territories, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, showing concentrations of mercury in fish. So Arctic char and lake trout, which are two fish species, are commonly used by northern peoples as a food source. So the concentrations in green are fish that fall, or the green dots and squares are fish that fall below this 0.2 milligram per kilogram guideline and are considered safe. The brown or reddish brown dots are fish that fall between 0.2 to 0.5 milligram per kilogram of mercury. And that's fish that is below the commercial sales guideline for Canada, but is not really ideal for people that eat fish every day. So for people that have a subsistence lifestyle based on harvesting fish, this is a potential concern. And then the orange dots, and there's a number of them here, depict fish populations where the mercury is above Health Canada's fish consumption guidelines. So where the concentrations are elevated, and at that point they would recommend limiting your fish intake to only maybe once a week or something like that, depending on the actual concentrations. So as you can see, the point here that I want to make is that there are populations of fish in the Arctic where mercury levels are a concern, especially for people that rely on these fish to survive. So in the Arctic, there's a a dilemma. It's termed the Arctic dilemma because northern people, such as Inuit, rely on country foods for survival and subsistence, and those foods tend to be much more nutritious than the foods that they can get at the grocery store. And I use the term grocery store very loosely because a lot of the food that's commercially available in Arctic communities certainly doesn't include fresh fruit and vegetables and tends to be highly processed. But by the same token, it's this consumption of traditional country foods that also increases the exposure of these people to mercury. So this graph shows the concentration of mercury in blood of northern peoples throughout the circumpolar Arctic. And the size of the dot is proportional to the concentration. So Health Canada has a guideline of about 20 microgram per liter. The US EPA has a slightly lower guideline of 5.8. So you can see that a number, especially in Greenland, a number of communities have blood mercury levels that are above those guidelines. Most of them will fall between that sort of 5 to 20 microgram per liter bracket. There is some good news. So if you look at the colors here, the lighter colors are for health surveys that were done back in the early 90s, and then the darker purple dots are the ones that were done more recently. And in some places where they've gone back and resampled the same communities, you can see that there's been a decrease in blood mercury concentration over the last couple decades. So that's sort of a good news story there. Okay, so I want to switch now to methylmercury sources in Arctic freshwaters. And so what we've talked about so far is a little bit of background on mercury, why it's a concern, some of its toxic effects. We've looked at mercury in the Arctic, including wildlife and people. But I've purposely skipped this very key step, which is how do we go from inorganic mercury, which is the type of mercury that's deposited to Arctic landscapes, to methylmercury, which is the type of mercury that gets bioaccumulated and transferred into organisms. So this is sort of where I've done a lot of my own work, trying to figure out where is methylmercury produced, how is it produced, what factors are important for this conversion, and what are the sources of methylmercury to Arctic food webs. So as you saw in the video, some of the work that we do is up at Lake Hazen on northern Ellesmere Island, which is just off the northwest coast of Greenland. And we went and sampled a number of lakes and ponds in the area. They look something like that, and we have our base camp here, and then we kind of hike around to all these different sites and collect samples and conduct experiments. And the driving questions, again, are what are the sources of methylmercury? And what are the factors that control its production and its availability for bioaccumulation into aquatic food webs? So we looked in specific at two sites that we picked to do some more intensive work, which not so creatively called Pond 1 and Pond 2. And what we did at those two sites, we compiled a mass balance of methylmercury, or a budget, if you will. It's just looking at all the different components of the budget to figure out how much methylmercury is produced. So you have in one of these systems, so be it lakes or wetland ponds or anything like that, you can have inorganic mercury being converted to methylmercury in sediments. So this production of methylmercury is often associated with environments where there's not a whole lot of oxygen. So it could be deep waters of a lake or oceans, or the mud at the bottom of a lake or a pond or something like that. And we know this from studies that were conducted in more southerly latitudes, which is why that's where we started to look when we were looking for these sources in the Arctic. And then this mercury that's produced in the sediments, some of it can diffuse up and find its way into the water column, where it can become absorbed by plankton. So these are all the processes that we want to look at. There's also methylmercury that could be coming down in rainwater, for example. So you have atmospheric deposition of methylmercury. And then there's another important process here, which I haven't mentioned before, but methylmercury can be broken down, which is a really good thing, by solar radiation. So this is when we compile our budget of methylmercury for a lake, this is one of the processes that we have to take into account, measuring how much of this methylmercury gets broken down by solar radiation. And then, like I mentioned, then it's just a simple budget. We have mercury accumulation in the water column. We have external mercury coming in from the atmosphere and mercury losses from this photodegradation. And if you add and subtract them all up, you end up with methylmercury production, which is essentially how much methylmercury is produced in these sediments that finds its way into the water column where it could potentially become bioaccumulated. So don't worry, this is a really busy figure. Don't worry too much about the details. The bar graphs just show the total amount of methylmercury in each pond for our 3 study years, 2005, 2007, 2008. And a lot of the time, you can see there's an increase and a peak in the midsummer. So all it is when the conditions are right in midsummer, it's a little bit warmer. Bacteria, which are the organisms that we think are responsible for converting inorganic mercury to methylmercury, thrive. The conditions are right. They have warm temperatures. They have a lot of food available. And you see this accumulation of methylmercury in the water column. And then just this will be useful later, the concentrations in pond 1 of methylmercury were higher than in pond 2. One of the ways that we look at methylmercury in the water often is to say how much of all the mercury that's in the water is in this methylmercury form that's of concern. And in these ponds, we were actually very surprised to find, I'm not sure what's happening here, that over half of the methylmercury, or half of all the mercury in the pond was actually in this very toxic methylmercury form. So that was definitely a clue that tipped us that these ponds are quite likely hot spots for methylmercury production. Another thing that people often think of the Arctic as this desolate place where not a whole lot of life, and it's really, for me, I think that that's a myth, and I want to show just a little clip, and you'll be able to see here. Well, it's a little bit hard to see with the lights, but you see all these little dots, all these black dots there are all tiny little plankton. And then you see some of the bigger plankton, like this guy right there, swimming up and down. So actually, these ponds are teeming with life, which a lot of people wouldn't think for someplace, at 82 degrees north. So this is the concentrations of mercury in the zooplankton. So if you look, the pink lines here are concentrations of methylmercury in the zooplankton of pond 1 and pond 2. And you can see the concentrations are higher in pond 1 compared to pond 2. And this is kind of, backs up our mental model. The more, because recall that pond 1 had more methylmercury in the water. So the more methylmercury you have in the water, the more will end up in organisms, for bioaccumulation and later biomagnification through the rest of the food chain. The other thing that was quite surprising, this is what the bar graphs are depicting, is the percentage of the methylmercury that exists in these ponds, how much of that is stored within zooplankton. And up to 10% of all the methylmercury in these ponds are actually locked in zooplankton, which seems rather significant and shows how available that methylmercury is to become incorporated into living organisms. So I mentioned that deposition of methylmercury from the atmosphere was one of the things that we wanted to look at. So to do this, we set out these rainwater collectors on the tundra and collected rainwater, which we can then analyze for methylmercury. And there's a pack of wolves that likes to hang out around our camp at Lake Hazen, and they were very intrigued by this setup, apparently. Not as much as the smell of bacon for breakfast, though, I'll tell you that much. Don't worry too much about the numbers. We'll get to those in a second. And as I mentioned, photodemethylation, or the degradation of methylmercury in lake waters, is a key process that we have to consider, which is actually kind of a good news story, because it's a mechanism by which we can reduce how much methylmercury could be incorporated into food webs. So how do we measure this? Well, we take pond water, we stick it into either transparent bottles or dark bottles, and we incubate them in the lake for a number of days, and we just track what happens to this methyl mercury over time. So this is some data, and so in the dark bottles, so bottles are not exposed to sunlight. There's no, so this is a methyl mercury concentration here, and incubation time in days on the x-axis. So you see that in bottles that are kept in the dark, there's no change in methyl mercury concentration over time. But when you expose them to solar radiation, you see a sharp decrease in methyl mercury. And from this information, we can extract a rate. We can look at whether those days were cloudy or sunny, and quantify it all, and sort of extrapolate these kind of experimental results to an entire lake, so we know exactly what mass of methyl mercury was lost from photodegradation. So this is more of the same. We have photodegradation at 3 different depths, and so you see that at the surface, there's a very sharp decline in methyl mercury. And as you move deeper and deeper into a pond or a lake, that loss slows down. And the reason for that is obviously less light is going to reach the bottom of a lake. And in this case, actually it's all to do with UV radiation. So UV radiation is the type of solar radiation that has enough energy to cause methyl mercury to break down. So this is our budget. There's a lot of numbers, but we're just going to key in on a couple of the important ones. So this is what we're after all along. After we compile our entire methyl mercury budget, we get a number that says this is how much methyl mercury is produced in these ponds. And 2 things. First, you can compare this number to this number, which is the external input from the atmosphere. And you see the external inputs are completely negligible. So it reinforces this point that these ponds are the site. Sediments in ponds and shallow, small lakes are the site where methyl mercury is being produced in freshwater ecosystems in the Arctic. Just to put these in some kind of perspective, these kinds of production rates is what you'd expect for a wetland at temperate latitudes. So it's surprising that in an environment that doesn't have as much nutrients, the temperatures are colder, and yet the bacteria there are able to produce and convert just as much inorganic mercury into methyl mercury as they would be able to around here, down south. I get the feeling this is going to keep happening. And then these values are an order of magnitude smaller, and they're more comparable to what would happen in a larger lake down south. So this leads to another interesting point, is that we have 2 ponds, very similar. They're only about a 40-minute hike from one another, and yet they have a 10-fold difference in the amount of methyl mercury, in the rate of methyl mercury production at these sites. So it also tells us that there's a number of environmental factors which have to be very important in controlling how much methyl mercury is produced. So to look at these, we went to a whole bunch of different ponds and lakes. We collected these sediment cores, and we added tiny, tiny amounts of inorganic mercury. So less than is naturally present in the sediments to begin with, but it's labeled with a specific isotope, so we can sort of keep track of it. So we add this mercury to these sediment cores, we incubate them for a few hours, we freeze them, and then we analyze those when we come back down south to look at how much of this inorganic mercury that we added in the first place became converted to methyl mercury. And because we do this at a whole range of different sites, we can compare what sort of characteristics do sites that are very good at producing mercury have, and what sort of characteristics do sites that aren't very good at producing methyl mercury, what are those like? So we can compare and contrast across all our sites and get an idea of what environmental factors might be important for controlling how methyl mercury is produced. And skipping through some of the boring detail, not surprisingly, the concentration of methylmercury in these pond sediments was correlated to this potential, so the ability of these sediments to convert inorganic mercury to methylmercury, and also to how much mercury was present in the first place. So sites that have more mercury produce more methylmercury, which is also intuitive. So the production of methylmercury in these sediments is controlled by the potential of the bacteria to methylate mercury, and also how much mercury they have to work with. And if you look at pond water, how much methylmercury is in the pond water is a function of how much methylmercury is in the sediments, which sort of reinforces our mental model of you have production of methylmercury in the sediments, and that methylmercury then moves into the water where it can become incorporated into the food chain. And a couple of other key things that popped up for us was sites that had a lot of methane in the water tended to have a lot of methylmercury. And sites where nitrogen was more in the ammonium form as opposed to nitrate also tended to have higher concentrations of methylmercury. And all these two things are pointing at is the importance of microbial processes that take place in the absence of oxygen. So when those processes dominate, those conditions are right for producing methylmercury. When those processes don't dominate, it's typically because the conditions are right for processes that actually decompose methylmercury. And also, not surprisingly, there was a negative correlation between UVA exposure and methylmercury in pond water, and that just confirms what we saw with our photodemethylation experiments. So to conclude, these wetland ponds in the Arctic are hotspots for methylmercury production, and they can actually be compared to wetlands and lakes at temperate latitudes. The concentration in the pond water is controlled by production in the sediment and not at all by inputs from outside of these freshwater systems. And production is controlled by how much mercury is available, inorganic mercury is available to be methylated in the first place, and how good the bacteria are at converting this mercury into methylmercury. And then once methylmercury escapes the sediments and goes in the pond water, it can either become bioaccumulated or it can be photodegraded, which is actually one of the primary mechanisms controlling methylmercury in Arctic freshwaters. So just the last part of the talk, I want to show, we talked about freshwater, so now I thought we should look at what's happening in the Arctic Ocean, so in marine waters, in marine ecosystems. So this is a map showing some of our sampling sites throughout the Canadian Arctic archipelago. So you have Greenland here, Baffin Island here to orient yourself, and then you have the famed Northwest Passage through here. And we went around, we collected samples from these sites at different depths throughout these coastal seas to see where the methylmercury could be found. So we're working off the Canadian Coast Guard Amundsen icebreaker, which actually now has become very emblematic and is found on the $50 bill, the new $50 bill. I haven't seen one of those yet, but I got to see the real thing, so that's okay. And this is the kind of equipment that we would use. So we've got these sampling bottles that are attached to a cable and winch, and you can lower them into the ocean, and they can be triggered remotely to close at the desired depth. So that way we can sample a whole bunch of different depths throughout the ocean water column and sort of go hunting for our methylmercury. So this is what the data looks like. You can see, so we've got our different sampling years here, and we've got methylmercury concentrations here, and then each different color is a different depth. So on the left-hand side, we have the surface, and then you're moving to deeper and deeper depths. So the red color is the chlorophyll, where all the algae are hanging out. The green bar is the oxycline, where a lot of the organic matter decomposition is taking place. So as a result, it causes oxygen to be used up in seawater. So you've got bacteria decomposing organic matter and using up oxygen, and so we also thought that'd be a good place to look for methylmercury. And you've got the bottom of the ocean, which is just above those sediments. So in case sediments, again, are important in producing methylmercury, that might be a place to look for it. And the trend generally is the deeper you go in the ocean, the more methylmercury there is. But there's not a big difference between the bottom, just above the sediments, and this oxycline depth, which can be hundreds of meters above the bottom. So in this case, it doesn't look like the sediments are the primary source of methylmercury. These graphs decided not to show up. Not a big deal. All I wanted to show here is that methylmercury correlates very nicely with the concentration of nutrients in the ocean. And nutrients in the ocean are generated when organic matter is decomposed by bacteria, which is something that typically happens at this oxycline depth. So similar to the experiments I was telling you guys about where we added mercury isotopes to sediment cores and then looked at how this inorganic mercury that we add becomes methylated into methylmercury, I did something very similar with seawater. I took bottles containing seawater and I added a tiny amount of inorganic mercury. I incubated them for about a day and then froze them and then measured how much methylmercury was in each of these bottles. And you can see that there's an increase in methylmercury. We did this at a couple different depths at a whole bunch of different sites, but there's an increase in methylmercury over time. So within the water itself, there are organisms, microorganisms that are capable of converting inorganic mercury to methylmercury. And then when we plug in from this experimental data, we can extract rates and plug those into a computer model. And when we crunch all the numbers, it turns out that at least half of all the methylmercury present in Arctic seawater is produced within the water column itself. So I thought I'd show this picture because I always find it very interesting. We also collected particles to see if particles had a lot of methylmercury. And so we did this at a few different depths. And so there's really, in the Arctic and in most oceans around the world, there's not a whole lot of particles. So it can take 20 liters to get enough particles to even put a little bit of color on these filters. They're only about this big. But the cool thing about it, I always find, is that if you look at the depth where the algae are hanging out, you can definitely see that when you filter that water, you see that nice green color from all the algae show up on those filters. And at the bottom, where we're near the sediments, we get a little bit of resuspension of bottom sediments, and that shows up too. And then the important thing about these is when we ran the particles on these filters, so even though there's not a whole lot of methylmercury in the ocean water, there's not a lot of particles in the ocean water, but the particles themselves have a lot of methylmercury. So if you think about it from the perspective of a plankton swimming around looking at detritus to feed on, they don't really care if there's not a lot of methylmercury in the water, because that's not what they're feeding on. They're feeding on these particles, which themselves are very rich in methylmercury. So from the perspective of a plankton, this is probably where they're getting all their methylmercury from. And that starts the whole process, because the plankton are at the base of the food chain. So there's a lot here going on, but we can just look at sort of the part that's happening in the ocean. And it's just sort of a picture of what I was just talking about. So we can think of methylmercury, inorganic mercury being produced to methylmercury in the ocean water, and that's associated with the decomposition of organic matter. So this organic matter, so it's dead algae. They're at the surface. They die. They sink, and they become decomposed by bacteria, and they're bacteria food. And then that provides energy for these bacteria to then convert inorganic mercury to methylmercury, and that starts the whole uptake into the bottom of the food chain, and so on and so forth. Bioaccumulation, biomagnification, all the way up to people. So that's sort of a visual conclusion. So we saw that in marine systems, unlike freshwater systems, the main source of methylmercury is in the sediments at the bottom, but it's the water column. And that's the production of methylmercury in ocean waters is associated with this decomposition of organic matter. Other sources of methylmercury to the Arctic Ocean could include rivers. Those might be important in coastal areas, as well as some production in sediments, but that's not the main source. And then suspended particles, as I mentioned, could play a key role because the concentrations of methylmercury are much higher in particles than in bulk water. So organisms that feed on these particles are actually experiencing more methylmercury than you'd think if you were just thinking about it from a bulk water perspective. So I thought I'd end with some positive messages because environmental scientists are often accused of just being Debbie Downers and always trying to scare people into thinking the world is about to end. And I think that with a lot of environmental problems, really we just have to think about solutions. And mercury is no different. A number of experiments have shown that ecosystems can respond and recover following decreases in mercury inputs. What's important to keep in mind is to have reasonable expectations. So if we turn around and we decrease our mercury emissions, we can't go to a lake, sample the fish, and expect them overnight to suddenly, have much lower mercury concentrations. In a lake, in a small lake on the boreal shield, it might only take a few years for fish mercury concentrations to decrease. In larger lakes, and especially in oceans, the recovery of those ecosystems is going to take decades and centuries. But they will recover. But it's important that we keep in mind that we need to have reasonable expectations of how long this might take. And so I'm also very happy that this year, the UNEP, so United Nations Environment Program, a Minamata Convention was agreed. So this is an international treaty that has been ratified by, I think now 96 nations. But anyways, all the circumpolar nations, so good news for the Arctic. And the Minamata Convention regulates mercury emissions. It prohibits the development of new mercury mines. It makes provisions for phasing out of some of the old mercury mines. All sorts of things are really meant to directly address some of the issues pertaining to mercury. And because it's now more and more widely accepted that the only way forward for solving the issue of mercury contamination in the environment is really just for us to decrease our emissions. This picture didn't show up either. Anyways, this was more good news story. It was just a graph that shows that in certain parts of the Arctic, if we look at recent data sets, when we've gone out over the past few decades and measured mercury in organisms, we see decreases now in concentrations in certain areas. So in Northern Europe, for example, as you saw, Europe had decreasing emissions in recent years. Well, some of those wildlife populations are also now showing similar decreases in mercury concentrations. So more good news there. Okay, well, thanks a lot for your attention, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.